Hello, welcome to part two now. We are now into the next phase of this series, Was This God's Idea? Where we're looking at the creation account of Genesis and talking about the points that are made, the counterpoints, and the implications of all of this. So we're going to set the stage for this next part where we're going to talk about young earth creationism, old earth creationism, evolutionary creationism, and intelligent design. Before we get into each of those four stances, we want to lay some groundwork and some foundational principles for this part of the series. So it's important to understand what shapes this debate. First thing I want to address is the equivocation of terms. Now, what we're dealing with here is changing the meaning of terms basically in the middle of an argument, saying one thing means something and then really arguing it from a different point of view. The most common word that this happens with is the word itself, evolution. A lot of times people will make certain claims. Well, don't you believe in change over time that you can see and that there's a process that things do change over time? And someone says, yes, of course, I believe in that. And they say, okay, well, then you believe in evolution, which means you then believe in ABC, and they define evolution differently at that point. And so this is done by both sides. It's done with lots of different terms. That's probably the most common example, but to be aware of that as we're going through this discussion. Another thing that comes up a lot is micro versus macro evolution. And some people don't even like these two terms at all and don't think they should be a part of the debate. You will hear them used quite a bit, though, and we will actually highlight these two terms when we get to the evolutionary creationism point of view, because the person representing that will use both of these terms. But microevolution, if you hear it, refers more to the evolution or change that you will see within a species. So mutations, for example. And then macroevolution is really that broader idea of your molecules to monkey to man, evolution across from one species to another. What happens a lot of times, because we're using different terms or we'll change the game in the middle of the game, is that it leads to straw man arguments from both sides, where they basically build up an argument and then tear it down, and it's not the actual position of the other side. So all of that is unfortunate, a part of this whole discussion. Another thing that I've highlighted differently in a different color there, because it is dealing with the terminology we use, but it's not really equivocating or changing the meaning of terms in the middle of the debate, but it's just understanding this from the outset. When you're talking with certain perspectives of creationism, they're really going to focus and hone in on this idea of kinds that is used in Genesis. Genesis 7 in particular talks about kinds when it's talking about animals and the ark. And so it talks about every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind. And you have this repeated idea of this kind. And what we've come up with since then is man-made classification systems that we've come up with to organize categories such as family, order, species. But what people will argue from this biblical standpoint is that God created and grouped living things after their own kinds. And these two groupings, this kinds versus the way we classify animals now, don't necessarily share the same criteria or boundaries for these categories. So the thinking here goes that the original created kinds could easily give rise to many different varieties, and any two creatures that can produce fertile offspring are of the same kind. Now, this will have a dramatic impact on the debate over what animals were really in existence at the time and went on the ark, for example. But that's just something to keep in mind as we go through these different positions. Another major point is this idea of observational science or experimental science versus historical science. So with your observational science, you're dealing with those things that have repeatability to them. You can have repeatable experiments. This is your lab work idea that you see with biology, chemistry, physics, for example. And then you've got historical science, where you're dealing more with studying things that are one-time events, the origin of the earth, the origin of life, for example, which is what all of this deals with. And these different fields of science that look back on things that are not repeatable. They are unique. And that is one of the things that comes up as a source of contention and debate when we're dealing with this, is people will say you can't really analyze or experiment with the creation account because it was a one-time unique event. So you will hear those things brought up. Another major thing that I've mentioned before that I think is important because it's a foundational piece to this whole thing is that all of this really seems to be based on worldviews and assumptions that we bring in to the debate, because we all have the same evidence. As you've heard me say, the joke goes that you have a creationist and an evolutionist, both standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon looking at it, and then they turn to each other and say, "See, told you so." It's really the same evidence, but they look at it two different ways. An example of this that comes up a lot is the idea of a common ancestor versus a common designer. So if you're going into it and looking at the evidence with all the similarities we see in design between different species, between different animals, one person will look at that and go, "See, that's obviously an illustration of common ancestry. We all evolved from the same ancestor." Another person will look at that and go, "See, that is clearly what would happen if you had a common designer. If God was making all of this, if you had a creator, it makes sense that there would be similarities in design." So whether or not you start with the Bible as your starting point, as your launch point, is going to matter significantly, and what you think of the Bible. So as Pete Enns, who argues against literalism, says literalism itself is a hermeneutic, which means it's a way that we interpret the Bible. So we spent part one of this series really talking about how we interpret literature or genres of writing. And that is why, because how we come to the text is going to influence how we understand this part of the debate. And this will also be a key part of the intelligent design debate, because basically the argument from both sides is going to be you find what you're looking for. So when we talk about there being evidence for an intelligent designer, people who are against that position are going to say, well, that's because you're looking for intelligence. And when you're looking for it, you're going to say that it's showing up in places where really you could have randomness just as well be a part of that. The other side's going to say, well, if you're looking for randomness, if you're looking for coincidence, if you're looking for a natural process that doesn't have an outside influence, then that's what you're going to find as well. That brings us to our final big point here, and that is the understanding of the words catastrophism or catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. So there's one field of thought that says things did happen literally, things did happen historically, including the flood. And we need to understand that the flood itself was a major, significant, dramatic global event that changed everything. It changed the atmosphere, it changed geology, it changed decay rates. So it's going to alter how old we think things are based off of that. Catastrophic supernatural influence that changes everything. And that's going to shape how we understand the world today and looking backward. The other field of thought is this uniformitarianism, which is a natural way of looking at everything. It really was popularized in the late 1700s. You had James Hutton, who wrote that no powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. And then that work influenced Lyell, who influenced Darwin, and so on and so forth. So the gradual processes over time, over long periods of time, and that you look at the earth the way it is now, and that is the key to understanding the way it was in the past, and just extrapolating that over time. So those are some foundational elements that we need to keep in mind as we go into the next part of understanding these different perspectives of creation. Thanks a lot.